Osama bin Laden, leader of al-Qaeda, killed in a raid in Abbottabad, Pakistan, May 2nd, 2011. Anwar al-Awlaki, an American, a senior leader and recruiter for al-Qaeda, killed by a US drone strike in Yemen on September 30th, 2011. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq, also killed by a US drone strike in Iraq on June 6, 2006. And finally, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin and Abdelaziz al-Rantizi, founders and leaders of Hamas, both killed 2004 in Gaza City by Hellfire missiles. Now, despite the death of these incredibly high-profile leaders, all of these organizations are still active and quite strong. Let's look at al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has affiliates that span the globe. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, the al-Nusra Front in Syria, al-Shabaab, new affiliates emerging in South Asia and elsewhere. This graph shows the number of attacks carried out by al-Qaeda and its affiliates by year since 2001. And you can see the group has remained active with a noticeable increase over the past 2 years. Hamas. 2 years after the deaths of Hamas founders Yassin and Rantizi, the group went on to win a majority of seats in the Palestinian Legislative Council in 2006. Israel has been targeting Hamas leaders since 1988, yet the group remains active. This chart shows the number of attacks carried out by Hamas per year, and as you can see, except for a slight decline with the ceasefire after the Gaza war, the group remains active. Finally, despite the death of Zarqawi, leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq, and the virtual defeat of the organization after the US collaborated with Iraqi tribal leaders in the Anbar Awakening, the organization resurfaced and became what we now know of as ISIS, or the Islamic State, an incredibly brutal and violent organization that controls now a vast amount of territory in Syria and Iraq. So, does leadership targeting work? Well, the answer is more complicated than it seems. Leadership decapitation, it's not a literal term, refers to the arrest or killing of terrorist leaders, has become one of the primary components of our current counterterrorism policy today. The use of unmanned aerial vehicles or drone strikes has become the primary way by which high-level leaders and lower-level operatives are currently targeted. It's seen as the best way to dismantle a terrorist network. This chart shows the number of times that leaders have been arrested or killed since 1980. And you can see an increase starting in 2001 after the attacks on 9/11. Now, there's a lot of ways that we can evaluate the success of counterterrorism policies, like targeting. We can look at whether they disrupt an organization's ability to carry out attacks, or very lethal or damaging attacks. They can damage a group's ability to communicate or just engage in day-to-day functioning. They can cause succession problems in leadership. They can cause a group to splinter or fractionalize. Or in the most extreme cases, it can ultimately cause group death, the utter demise of an organization. But counterterrorism policies can also have counterproductive or adverse consequences, increasing attacks, retaliation, or fueling recruitment or radicalization. Now, I want to look at a few cases of decapitation that are seen as classic examples of decapitation successes. Abimael Guzman, leader of Shining Path, a Peruvian Maoist insurgent organization, was captured in Lima by Peruvian authorities in 1992. Now, images of him like this in a tiger cage in striped prison attire were widely broadcasted. This was a humiliating and demoralizing blow to both Guzman and to the organization. But the group remained active. Leadership was assumed by Oscar Durand, who continued to lead a severely weakened but still active organization. Abdullah Öcalan was leader of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK. He was captured in Kenya in 1999 and sentenced to life imprisonment. Now, despite his arrest and his repeated calls that his followers renounce violence, the organization saw a decline, but they still continued to carry out activity and are still active today. So why then these cases that are seen as classic examples of decapitation successes, upon closer examination, we see that they're not as effective as people seem to think? So why is it so frequently assumed to be this terrific strategy for eliminating the threat of terrorism? Well, this is Shoko Asahara, who was leader of Aum Shinrikyo, the Japanese terrorist organization that released sarin gas on the Tokyo subway in 1995. He was treated like a deity, like a godlike figure by his followers. And this belief that terrorist organizations are headed by charismatic leaders who are seen as having divine or supernatural qualities that makes them utterly irreplaceable. This belief has been used to justify much of our current counterterrorism operations. The problem with this perspective, though, is that if all terrorist groups are headed by charismatic leaders, then it should work all the time, removing a leader. But it doesn't. Sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't work. So this explanation can't really tell us much about when and why. So when does targeting work? When does it cause a decline of militant activity? Or when does it have adverse consequences? In order to do this, I felt that it was important to look beyond the individual qualities of the person targeted and instead look at characteristics of the groups, of the organizations who are being targeted. So in order to do this, I collected data on about 300 cases of leadership targeting against over 90 terrorist groups since 1970. Now, in order to evaluate whether or not it was an effective policy, I looked at a 2-year period after which a group experienced the removal of their leaders. If the group remained inactive during that 2-year period, then it was seen as a success. If they resumed activity, a failure. Now, interestingly, what I found is that groups that don't have their leaders targeted actually fall apart at a higher rate than those whose leaders were targeted. So, and additionally, I found that a group's age, its size, and its type were very good predictors for understanding when it works and when it doesn't work. First, young groups are easier to weaken from having their leaders targeted. In fact, once a group crosses the threshold of being active for 20 years, they become quite stable and hard to weaken. Second, I looked at size. And I found that small groups were also easier to destabilize than large groups. And after an organization has over 500 members, they become exceedingly resilient. And finally, I found that religious groups and separatist groups are much more stable and much harder to weaken than ideological groups, which would include things like left and right-wing political organizations. So what is it about these young, small, and ideological groups that makes them easier to weaken than older, larger, religious, or separatist groups? Well, I think it's a function of two primary explanations: how much bureaucracy an organization has, and how much popular or communal support they have. Now, bureaucracy seems like kind of a strange concept for thinking about terrorist groups. We tend to think of bureaucracies as governments or businesses or military hierarchy. But terrorist groups can be bureaucratized to the extent that they have things like an organized administrative staff, a division of labor and responsibilities, a hierarchy of authority, a stable structure of rules and policies and procedures. And it's these factors that make groups stable. Now, terrorist groups are interesting. They can be bureaucratized at the upper levels of the organization, and at the lower levels, they can be decentralized, operating in a loose network of cells. And it's this combination that makes groups very strong. This quasi-bureaucratic structure allows groups to recover easily from shocks to its leadership by having not only clear succession mechanisms in place, but also by having their operational cells distinct from the leaders that are being targeted. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is communal support. Organizations depend upon support in order to get the kinds of resources they need to function as a clandestine or secretive organization. Groups need basic resources like food and money and safe houses and intelligence and informants, all things that allow groups the ability to evade detection or surveillance by security forces. And support allows groups the ability to do this. Support also provides groups with a constant pool of new recruits in order to replenish their membership. Ultimately, that's what groups need. They need people. And finally, groups with lots of support tend to be seen as more legitimate in the communities from which they emerge and in which they're operating, which further bolsters their sense of strength and resilience. Now, the problem is targeting groups with lots of communal support runs the risk of having adverse consequences. It can cause a group to carry out retaliatory attacks, or fuel recruitment, or radicalization, or increase sympathy for the movement. And civilian deaths, which often occur when we're targeting leaders, can intensify this effect. Hamas, for instance, has carried out many retaliatory attacks in response to the killing of highly revered leaders. In one notable example, after the death of Yahya Ayash, who was one of Hamas's chief bomb makers, the organization carried out 4 bus bombings in which over 50 people were killed. And these bombings were attributed directly to the death of Ayash, or the assassination of Sheikh Yassin, who I mentioned before. His death triggered not just local, but international outrage and condemnation. He was seen as a spiritual leader of the group. So, given all this, what does this mean for our counterterrorism policies? What should we be doing? Well, I think this all suggests that the kinds of groups that we're targeting today are not likely to be, in the long term, greatly affected by leadership targeting. So let's look at al-Qaeda as an example. Al-Qaeda possesses many of the characteristics that makes a group more resilient to leadership targeting. First, they're older. Formed in 1988, al-Qaeda is now over 25 years old. They've crossed the threshold for which groups become quite strong and resilient. Second, it's a religious organization. Its goals include the establishment of a pan-Islamic caliphate, overthrowing non-Islamic regimes, expelling infidels from Muslim lands. And finally, it's large. Now, there's quite a bit of dispute and disagreement over the size of al-Qaeda. It's difficult to know a group's exact size. They're not really, advertising this kind of information. But I think it's safe to assume that it has, at least somewhere between 100 and 500 members, al-Qaeda and its affiliated organizations as well. A threshold at which groups also become quite stable. Now, al-Qaeda has experienced, from 2001 to 2012, over 200 leaders have been targeted. And this is both top leaders and sort of lower level leaders as well. But the group is still active. So why is that? What explains it? Well, Al-Qaeda is a surprisingly bureaucratized organization. Documents captured in Iraq and elsewhere paint a picture of a group with a lot of paperwork. They have clear voting laws, political processes, salaries, rosters, and a division of responsibilities. They have a separate security, military, political, propaganda wings. Moreover, in many of the communities in which al-Qaeda is operating and emerging, they have some support from their local communities that allow them access to the kinds of human and material resources that groups need to function. So I think all of this suggests that decapitation is not likely to be an effective long-term strategy against al-Qaeda. In the short run, there might be destabilization, there might even be a decline in activity. But over the long run, the organization should be able to regroup and recover and continue carrying out terrorist attacks. But it's likely that targeting leaders is going to remain a core aspect of our counterterrorism policies, particularly using unmanned aerial vehicles or drone strikes, which are seen as a low-cost means by which to target leaders. They pose their own unique set of challenges. Now, even if drone strikes don't cause a significant decline in a group's activity, the fact that leaders are being killed is seen as a success. Publics like to see that leaders are being killed. It signals that our governments are strong and they're waging an effective campaign against terrorism. Moreover, the death of highly brutal and violent leaders appeals to our own sense of justice and retribution. But if these policies are not only ineffective, but run the risk of having these counterproductive outcomes, like causing an increase in retaliatory attacks, or radicalization, or sympathy for the overall movement, then we have to ask whether or not this should remain at the center of our current counterterrorism policies. Thank you.